Okay, so you want to understand how money and power have really been kind of tied together throughout history.
Yeah.
Well, for this deep dive, um, we're going way back to the Roman Catholic Church.
Okay.
You sent us The Vatican Billions by Avro Manhattan, and this book really digs into the church's financial journey. It's fascinating.
You know, we often see economics and religion as separate,
Right, yeah.
but this book really shows how they've been deeply connected for centuries.
Yeah,
What's especially interesting is how the church's financial practices influenced its evolution
yeah,
and even sparked rebellions and change.
exactly. And it all starts with a contrast.
Okay.
The book talks about how early Christians actually gave up their worldly possessions to help those in need.
Yeah.
But as the church gained power and influence, things started to shift a little.
Think about it. The early Christians,
Right.
they lived in a time of persecution.
Yeah.
Their focus was on spiritual community and helping those on the margins of society. But by the 4th century, with Constantine's recognition of Christianity, the church found itself in a new position of authority.
So instead of simple living, we start to see these lavish cathedrals and elaborate ceremonies.
Right.
It's like they went from rags to riches, literally.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
These grand displays of wealth weren't just about aesthetics.
Yeah.
They were a powerful symbol of the church's growing influence.
Right.
And this shift had a major impact on how the church generated and managed its wealth.
The book then takes us into the world of pilgrimages, particularly to Rome, where visiting St. Peter's tomb became a major source of income for the church.
It's fascinating
Yeah.
because despite the lack of historical evidence that Peter was ever in Rome,
Really?
the belief that his tomb was there fueled a huge influx of pilgrims, generating significant wealth for the church.
They even had people convinced they could speak to St. Peter through a hole in his tomb. Imagine the stories that were circulating back then.
It really highlights how narratives and beliefs can be incredibly powerful.
Oh, yeah.
Even without factual basis.
Wow.
This cult of St. Peter, whether true or not,
Right.
contributed significantly to the church's authority and wealth.
And speaking of narratives, the book dives into this wild story about the donation of Constantine.
Yes.
It's a forged document basically claiming that Emperor Constantine gave the church control over vast territories.
This document wasn't just about land.
Right.
It provided the church with a powerful argument for political authority,
Yeah.
justifying their claim to power throughout Europe.
And it's not just the donation of Constantine.
Right.
They even forged a letter from heaven,
Mhm.
supposedly from St. Peter to King Pepin, urging him to protect the church's land. Talk about going to extreme lengths.
What's fascinating is how these forgeries illustrate the lengths institutions might go to
Yeah.
legitimize their power and control resources.
Wow.
It makes you think about how narratives, even false ones, can shape the course of history.
Absolutely. And they didn't stop there. They systematized their wealth collection through tithes and offerings. Right.
But it wasn't always done fairly.
Right. While tithes were meant to support the church in its work,
Right.
the book mentions instances of abuse where priests withheld services or
Okay.
demanded additional payments,
Yeah.
essentially profiting from people's spiritual needs.
It's like going to confession and being told you have to pay extra to be forgiven. It seems like a pretty big contradiction to what they were supposed to be teaching.
You can see how these practices would create tension.
Oh, yeah.
It raises questions about the balance of power and the potential for exploitation.
Right.
When an institution holds such sway over people's lives, both spiritual and temporal.
Then there's the Millennium Panic around the year 1000 AD when people were convinced the world was ending.
Imagine the fear that must have gripped people during that time.
I know.
And the church, in a way, capitalized on that fear.
People donated everything they had to the church, hoping to save their souls. It's fascinating how fear can be such a powerful motivator, especially when it comes to matters of faith and the afterlife.
And of course, the world didn't end.
Right.
But the church's coffers certainly benefited from the panic.
Yeah.
It shows how, even in times of crisis, the flow of money and resources doesn't stop.
Speaking of exploiting people's anxieties about the afterlife,
Yeah.
let's talk about indulgences. It's mind-blowing how the church basically started selling forgiveness.
Indulgences, initially meant to offer a path to atonement for sins,
Right.
transformed into a complex system. They became a way for people to essentially buy their way out of punishment,
Wow.
even for deceased loved ones.
Wait, you could buy your way out of purgatory for someone who is already dead. How did people believe that?
Remember, the church held immense power and influence. People trusted them
Right.
for their spiritual guidance and salvation, even when it came to financial matters.
I suppose when the church tells you something is a divine pathway, it carries a lot of weight.
Yeah.
But as we know,
Mm.
not everyone blindly accepted these practices.
Right.
Martin Luther, in particular, had some strong words for the church on this issue.
Absolutely. Luther viewed the sale of indulgences as a blatant exploitation of faith for profit. It contradicted his core belief
Yeah.
that salvation came through faith and God's grace, not through financial transactions.
Wow.
This was a key catalyst for the Reformation.
And from what I understand, this wasn't just about paying a small fee for a minor sin.
Yeah.
It became this elaborate system with varying levels of indulgences, even for the dead.
You could essentially purchase indulgences for deceased loved ones,
Oh, wow.
aiming to lessen their time in purgatory.
Really?
It was a complex and lucrative system,
Hmm.
but it raised significant ethical concerns.
Imagine the moral implications of that. Buying your way out of divine punishment.
Yeah.
It seems to undermine personal responsibility and the very essence of repentance.
That was precisely Luther's point. He emphasized that true repentance involved a genuine change of heart and a commitment to living a righteous life, not financial shortcuts.
Faith, not funds.
Right.
It makes you wonder why the church clung so tightly to this system,
Yeah.
even in the face of mounting criticism.
The church was deeply entrenched in its financial practices.
Right.
Change was slow,
Yeah.
and the allure of wealth and power proved difficult to resist.
But eventually, the backlash against indulgences became too strong to ignore.
Right.
They risked losing even more followers if they didn't address these concerns.
Exactly. The Reformation, sparked in part by these financial disputes,
Yeah.
led to a significant split within the church.
Right?
To survive, the Catholic Church had to confront these issues and attempt to regain trust.
It's incredible how financial practices within the church could trigger such a massive upheaval,
Yeah.
ultimately changing the landscape of religion and even influencing political structures across Europe.
It's a powerful reminder that economic forces, even within a religious context, can have a profound and lasting impact on society.
And just when you think it can't get any crazier, we get to Columbus and the discovery of the Americas.
This is where the donation of Constantine resurfaces in a big way.
Oh, wow.
Armed with this centuries-old forged document, the church essentially claimed ownership of the newly discovered lands
Wow.
and granted Spain the right to conquer them.
It's mind-boggling to think how this fake document, created centuries earlier, played a role in shaping the colonization of the Americas
Yeah.
and the exploitation of its resources.
The papal bull issued by Alexander VI in 1493, dividing the world between Spain and Portugal,
Oh, wow.
demonstrates the intertwined nature of religious authority and political ambition during that era.
Right.
It raises significant questions about the role of religion in justifying colonialism.
It's both fascinating and troubling to see how the church wielded its power to influence global events,
Yeah.
using a document that was essentially a fabrication.
It's a complex part of history
Yeah.
that forces us to confront the darker side of power dynamics and how ideologies, even religious ones, can be used to justify questionable actions.
Right.
But there's more to this story.
Hold on. We're already at the edge of our seats. You're telling us there's more.
Oh, yes. The consequences of the church's financial practices extend far beyond what we've discussed so far. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll uncover how these actions sparked internal conflicts, rebellion, and calls for reform
Got it.
from within the church itself. Stay tuned.
This is getting more and more intriguing by the minute. We can't wait to hear what happens next.
It's going to be good. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Vatican billions. As we've seen, the church's accumulation of wealth throughout history wasn't without its controversies.
It's amazing how they managed to build such an incredible fortune.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, did they have, like, medieval accountants and financial advisors figuring all this out?
You know, the book doesn't delve into the specifics of their financial management, but it does highlight the various ways they generated revenue beyond the usual tithes and offerings.
So besides selling forgiveness and claiming ownership of continents, what other brilliant ideas did they come up with?
Well, remember those pilgrimages we discussed?
Yeah.
They weren't just spiritual journeys.
Right?
They evolved into significant revenue generators, especially when tied to special events like jubilees.
Jubilees. Forgive me if my medieval history is a bit rusty.
Yeah.
What were those all about?
Think of it like a mega pilgrimage with a spiritual bonus.
Okay.
In the year 1300, Pope Boniface VIII declared a special year of Jubilee, offering complete pardon for sins to those who visited specific basilicas in Rome.
A free pass to heaven just for a trip to Rome. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal, even back then.
It was, and people flocked to Rome in droves.
Wow.
It was a massive event, strategically timed, might I add, to
Yeah.
give the church's finances a much-needed boost.
So the Pope essentially orchestrated a mega event to generate revenue for the church. Sounds like a genius marketing strategy, centuries ahead of its time.
Indeed. And it worked spectacularly well.
Wow.
The influx of pilgrims was so great that Rome could barely handle the crowds.
Oh, wow.
But as with many things related to money and power, not everyone was on board with all of the church's financial practices.
You're talking about the indulgences again, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to grasp the idea that people genuinely believe they could reduce their time in purgatory by paying money.
It's crucial to remember the context of that era.
Yeah.
The church held immense authority,
Right.
and people relied on them for spiritual guidance.
Right.
In a world riddled with uncertainty and fear, the promise of salvation, even through financial means,
Right.
held immense appeal.
I suppose when the church tells you something is a divine pathway, it carries a lot of weight.
Yes.
But as we know, not everyone blindly accepted these practices.
Right.
Martin Luther, in particular, had some strong words for the church on this issue.
Absolutely. Luther viewed the sale of indulgences as a blatant exploitation of faith for profit. It contradicted his core belief that salvation came through faith and God's grace, not through financial transactions.
Wow.
This was a key catalyst for the Reformation.
And from what I understand, this wasn't just about paying a small fee for a minor sin.
Yeah.
It became this elaborate system with varying levels of indulgences,
Right.
even for the dead.
You could essentially purchase indulgences for deceased loved ones, aiming to lessen their time in purgatory.
Oh, wow.
It was a complex and lucrative system,
Yeah.
but it raised significant ethical concerns.
Imagine the moral implications of that. Buying your way out of divine punishment.
Yes.
It seems to undermine personal responsibility and the very essence of repentance.
That was precisely Luther's point.
Okay.
He emphasized that true repentance involved a genuine change of heart
Right.
and a commitment to living a righteous life, not financial shortcuts.
Faith, not funds. Right. It makes you wonder why the church clung so tightly to this system, even in the face of mounting criticism.
The church was deeply entrenched in its financial practices.
Right.
Change was slow, and the allure of wealth and power proved difficult to resist.
But eventually, the backlash against indulgences became too strong to ignore.
Yeah.
They risked losing even more followers if they didn't address these concerns.
Exactly. The Reformation, sparked in part by these financial disputes, led to a significant split within the church. To survive, the Catholic Church had to confront these issues and attempt to regain trust.
It's fascinating how these financial practices, which might seem trivial on the surface, ended up having a monumental impact on the course of religious history.
It highlights how economic factors can be intertwined with religious beliefs and practices,
Right.
often with far-reaching and unintended consequences. But there's another aspect of this story that's worth exploring.
More twists and turns. Lay it on us.
Let's talk about the miracles and supernatural events that were so prevalent in that era. The book suggests that the church may have used these occurrences to generate revenue as well.
Wait, are we saying they were staging miracles? Were people really that gullible back then?
Well, not necessarily staging miracles. It's more about how they were presented and utilized. Remember how relics, especially those associated with St. Peter, were big moneymakers?
Right.
It seems that miraculous stories connected to these relics enhanced their value and drew even more pilgrims.
So the more miraculous the tale, the more profitable the relic. That's a brilliant, if somewhat dubious, business strategy.
It's important to remember that the medieval worldview was vastly different from our own.
Right.
Belief in the supernatural was commonplace.
Yeah.
The church held immense authority in shaping people's understanding of the world, both the natural and the supernatural.
So if the church declared something a miracle, most people accepted it without question. That makes sense in a world without the scientific scrutiny we have today.
Exactly. This unquestioning belief in miracles allowed the church to leverage them for various purposes, including financial gain.
Okay, I need some examples here. What kind of miracles are we talking about?
Okay.
Did people actually witness Jesus walking on water or something?
Not quite that dramatic. But the book does mention some remarkable tales.
Okay.
There were claims of saints rising from the dead, flying through the air, even writing letters from heaven.
Letters from heaven.